All right. Well, here I am inside the studio, WRHU, for PPM number 27, recording the Dead Zone for that's going to be aired. Let me get in a way that I can be seen. For the Dead Zone that's going to be aired this Sunday. It's been a while since I got into the studio. It's kind of nice to be able to do this, sort of the two worlds colliding. And 2 weeks ago, as the show was on the air, I recorded a meditation and brought some of it in there. So today I'm making a Dead Zone and a poetic phenomenological meditation at the same time. So in the background is the Dead from Cleveland Music Hall, March the 3rd, 1981, and yeah, I guess I may be interrupted by some friends, but that's okay. That's part of what we're doing here. This is one of my first ever bootlegs, so every year around springtime, I sort of celebrate the beginning of spring by playing this show, 3/3/1981. Yeah, it's a great show. One of my first ever tapes that I collected as a bootlegger. Right, and so we're gonna I'm gonna have this in the background playing, and then oh, I know what I wanted to say. Yeah, so for spring, today's a beautiful day. Finally, it feels like spring outside today. It's got to be 60 degrees almost. It's definitely in the mid-50s, and once you get to that point, and that nip is gone, then you're moving into spring. So though this is the 11th of March, spring doesn't officially begin for another week or more. But this is my spring into spring show, I guess is what I'm going to call it. So I better get going, because after this song, Feel Like a Stranger, we're going to play another song, and then I'm going to have to break to do a mic break, and at that point I'll have to stop my meditation. So let me get going. So we're in the middle of we're going into PPM 27, and we're in the middle of a discussion of Socrates. And yesterday, it's also kind of appropriate that I'm in the studio today, because yesterday was the most important quotation for my work was read and concluded yesterday's meditation, and that was from the Phaedo, line 60 E to 61C, which includes, Socrates recounting his writing of lyrics. And so, and the famous line from Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy about the music-making Socrates comes from this section. So, in a way, this is what it's all about. This making music, making philosophy in different ways, originary ways. So I think it's apropos that the day after I read the section from the Phaedo, where Socrates is recounting writing the lyrics and gesturing towards a music-making philosophy, that I'm here recording a Dead Zone that'll be aired this Sunday, while actually I'm in Arizona, New Mexico, New Mexico. That's where I'm heading later today. Okay, so again, the quotation that concluded yesterday's meditation was the one from the Phaedo, and it's the one where Socrates says that the dream came to him like a spectator encouraging a runner in a race, was urging me on to do what I was already doing, that is practicing the arts, because philosophy is the greatest of the arts, and I was practicing. But ever since my trial, while the festival of the god has delayed my execution, I have felt that perhaps it might be that this popular form of art that the dream intended me to practice, in which case I ought to practice it and not disobey. So Socrates understood that maybe the philosophy that he was supposed to be practicing, maybe it wasn't philosophy after all that he should be practicing, but in fact was poetry, lyrical writing. And what I'm suggesting is that in fact what he understood by his practice, or what we can understand by his practice that he bequeathed us, is something called, what Nietzsche calls, music-making philosophy. Based on Nietzsche's idea of the music-practicing Socrates, we've come up with this category of music-making philosophy. And that, in fact, is what the project of Originary thinking is about, and really what the experiment that I'm sharing and documenting and recounting and commemorating this year is all about. So, right. Okay, so let's pick it up on the meditation that was written this date in 2004, 10 years ago on this date, March 11th. And yeah, let me just, before I move on to that, I'm going to have to prompt the tunes. Okay, so we have said that Socrates was put underway by the message he received from the oracle. The saying of the god's message, Socrates, you are wisest, held him out for questioning and drew him into questionability. He received the gift of teachability and thereby became teachable. And in being teachable, he was capable of learning. He passed on the gift he received in drawing others into the draft of the inquiry that had caught him. He was less sure of his ground, and he endured and remained steadfast in the wonder that was evoked in the tidings. Socrates' pathos, his passion for questioning, was his response to these tidings. His pathos also attracted others to him, especially young people who were energized by his openness and authentic engagement with others. Drawing others into the location of questioning, he compelled them to think along with him. In the dialogues, he set thinking in motion and turned others toward an attunement of being's processual unfolding. The dialogues expressed this process, this motion, and hence reflected the peripatetic quality of learning. In dialogue we wander, our talking is a walking, a movement, a seeking together. Friendship and community emerge from this thinking that is a wandering together. And this is why we say that our relationship with being is a learning, for learning is another way of describing our attunement or awareness with being, and being reposed in being's processual unfolding. Learning is the wandering thinking evoked by wonder, the dialogue where silence and attentive, intense listening predominates. Evocative speech, the saying of the first questions, or what Arendt, drawing on Kant, calls the ultimate questions, those questions of God, freedom, and immortality, which remain unanswerable, yet urgent and necessary. These questions emerge out of a passion and need that are inspired by the quest for meaning, to quote Arendt. In receiving the tidings, our juridical voice is silenced, and we endure the wonder of possibility that appears before us as we are held out to the nothing, the profundity of possibility of the not yet. This wonder is the beginning of thinking. It begins with thaumadzein, and ends with speechlessness. That's a quote from Arendt. The dismantling of the self-certain subject thus crumbles when compelled to endure the shaking ground of questioning. Unsettled by the seismic motion of being, the intellect, along with its cognitive quest for reliable and verifiable truth, are submerged by the flood of possibility that emerges when the shaking ground evokes a tidal wave of meaning that exceeds the capacity of certainty and evidence. The silencing of the juridical voice is filled with the song of poetic thinking. These unanswerable and ultimate questions reestablish us as teachers and learners, as question-asking beings. For Arendt, this poetic thinking, which she calls philosophy, is the ground or the condition for the possibility for science and cognition. Poetic thinking is a remembering of the question-asking being. In this remembering, we are reminded of our pathos to know. Without this pathos, knowledge, science, are meaningless and no better or worse than artificial intelligence of machines, which are still ultimately the products of human hands. Quote, in asking the ultimate unanswerable questions, man establishes himself as a question-asking being. This is the reason that science, which asks answerable questions, owes its origin to philosophy, an origin that remains its ever-present source throughout generations. Were man ever to lose his faculty of asking ultimate questions, he would by the same token lose his faculty of asking answerable questions. He would cease to be a question-asking being, which would be the end not only of philosophy, but of science as well. And that's a quote from Arendt's Philosophy and Politics, page 99. So long as we have gift givers, those who are capable of hearing the saying of other as autre, we are not in grave danger, the grave danger that Arendt alerts us to, as the always already not yet dismantling of the question-asking being that occurs when the human condition of plurality, spontaneity, freedom, and action are threatened by faceless, nameless institutional machinations. Faced with the specter of thoughtlessness, we seek teachers, those who are capable of nothing else than this, letting learning happen. And then I add so that's the end of that meditation, and then I add again one of those sort of pages that prints out, and there's a fragment that prompts a fragment, I guess is a prompting fragment, and it says, we know from Apology, Phaedo, and other Platonic dialogues that Socrates remained steadfast in the location where he could receive the tidings of the gods. In Plato's Symposium, however, we encounter another version of the legend of Socrates, the teacher, the one who let learning happen by drafting others to joining him in his wandering. And then I have the last words are saying and sage. So this is an interesting dialogue, in part because I drop into this quotation from Arendt that's really, really important at this point. So I'm sort of circling back to this relationship between philosophy as primary and science as secondary, and making this point through Arendt that if there's no philosophy, there's no science. If there's no philosophy, there's no quest for, what science calls things that are reliable and verifiable. So the fundamental quest of science, the fundamental quest of knowledge, is rooted in philosophy, in the unanswerable questions, or what she, borrowing from Kant, calls the ultimate questions. So that's really important, because it suggests that the endeavor of originary thinking, if you will, is to create the conditions for more science. So that's important. But at the same time, I'm not entirely satisfied with that move, because I don't myself understand the project of originary thinking, and the coincidence of my saying this in this line from the Dead here, don't you let that deal go down. No, I'm not letting the deal go down. And the deal that I'm not letting go down, if you'll indulge me in this, is the deal that is seeing philosophy as a kind of handmaiden of the science. That's not what this is about. And I think Heidegger, I think Arendt's point is to draw attention to the sciences and the scientist, and to draw their attention to sort of like the foundation or origin of their work. And it's true, there is, even a contemporary figure like Stephen Hawking, who just dismisses philosophers for not having kept up with science, and so he reverses the order. So there's this sort of arrogance and a sort of chauvinism, right, of the hard sciences, that philosophy isn't worth your while because they don't show any progress and they can't keep up with the sciences. So they reverse the order and say the sciences are the ones that establish the progress of humankind, if you will, and that philosophy can't keep up, so therefore it's been left behind and should be left behind. Whereas what Arendt then is saying is, no, philosophy, our ability to even raise questions, scientific questions, is always cultivated and kept going by philosophy. So, this is an important point, but I'm really not interested in that line, because I'm not so much interested in defending philosophy as useful for the sciences. And I think, unfortunately, in my field, philosophy of education, there's this tendency to come back to this point to say, well, we're only so good as we are useful. And that's entirely ridiculous in my point, and it totally misses the point of philosophy. If it's the case that philosophy is rooted in wonder, which is one of the quotations here, it's rooted in the Greek word that I had trouble saying is thaumadzein. If philosophy is born of wonder, And I'm arguing, and not arguing, but I'm in my description of the relationship between being and learning, that state of wonder is the fundamental state of the relationship between being and learning. That is to say, on the side of the learner. Learning is happening in the state of wonder, at the threshold of language, speechlessness. So Arendt's quotation that was very important. What does she say? This quotation that I read kind of quickly, that the wonder is the beginning of philosophy. It begins with thaumadzein, wonder, and ends with speechlessness. So it's interesting. Wonder begins thinking. It begins with wonder and ends with speechlessness. So let's go there. I mean, I'm saying let's follow that point. Let's say that we are always within that threshold, or we walk through it. We begin at the threshold of wonder, and then we walk through it, and we are in this situation of sorry, there's someone at the door. We are in the situation of speechlessness in the beginning and at the end. So I like this notion. It's like the eternal recurrence that we move through. We go to the threshold, we move into the open region, we wander with being, and then we come back, and at the end we are in this threshold of before language. Now, this is key to me. So what I'm interested then is what happens with philosophy as it moves into this open region. You know, this is what first philosophy is, and I suppose what I'm saying is I'm interested in maintaining the trajectory of first philosophy, the work of first philosophy, and not have it defined as a handmaiden, which is to say in its relationship to what would be then secondary work. And this morning I talked about, issues that I have with some, not issues, but, my critique of our field, philosophy of education, really comes down to my critique of this tendency to understand the field as derivative of primary work, and as taking that primary work and then, translating it and applying it. For many, this is what philosophy of education is about. It's the philosopher with a view towards education understood really and reduced to schooling. And for me, let's reverse the order. Let's talk about first philosophy, and let's talk about the education that we receive from first philosophy, which is a way for me to bring in the relationship of being and learning. That is to say that philosophy, if it's educating, is doing so because it's mediating, if you will, and transmitting as a kind of media, the relationship between being and the human being. So the relationship of being and learning is mediated through philosophy. First and foremost in our encounter with philosophers, which is why I'm always working with primary text, and then beyond that, in the place of originary thinking, or beyond the relationship with the originary philosophers, we start doing our own originary work. So this is key. I think that's the key for me of this meditation, is both this point that Arendt is making, the quotation about philosophy beginning with wonder and ending with speechlessness, as a way of talking about the movement in the threshold, going through it, then going into it, through it, into the open region, the wandering, and then back and coming back to the threshold, which is both the place of wonder and the place of speechlessness. And that circle is very important in terms of the eternal recurrence. So this is the key, and it's to underline the point that originary thinking in the project that I'm experimenting with here is not understood as a handmaiden to the sciences. And I think that's going to do it. The next meditation, I'll be reading it from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Once again, this is from the studios at WRHU and the campus of Hofstra University. This is Studio North, where when I am not doing my show live, I record the Dead Zone. And this is the Dead Zone that's going to be aired for the first time on March 16th, 2014. So this Sunday, coming Sunday. And we're listening to The Dead from March the 3rd, 1981, from the Cleveland Music Hall. It's one of the show that springs me into spring. It's my spring show. Has been for years. Always play this. And in part because this is the tide that took me that sprung me into being a deadhead, quote unquote. I had received this as a bootleg tape back in 1984. I'd already seen The Dead, I'd already seen Garcia, but my first bootleg that I came into was a copy of this show, and I received it in my home state of Maine. So, nice circles there. Okay, it's going to wrap it up.